The night air is cool and crisp as Evelyn Williams slowly makes her way down the sidewalk, her cane tapping softly against the cracked pavement with each step. She's not in a hurry. She never is anymore. But there's a rhythm to her movements, a deliberate pace that comes with age and wisdom. Her fur coat, once luxurious, is now a little threadbare at the edges, its rich brown color fading in the glow of the streetlights. Evelyn is 78 years old, and though time has bent her body, it hasn't broken her spirit. The street around her is quiet. The only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustling of leaves from the nearby trees. The world seems paused, holding its breath as she walks toward the restaurant, a place she's frequented for years. The upscale bistro looms ahead, its large glass windows reflecting the streetlights, the kind of restaurant that draws in those who want to be seen, refined, polished, and expensive. For a moment it feels like another time to Evelyn, one when she would have been younger, perhaps out on the town with friends, or even better, out with her late husband, dressed up for a night of celebration. She stops outside the restaurant's heavy doors, adjusts her glasses and takes a breath, smoothing the fur around her shoulders. She's not nervous. She's used to this ritual, the familiar feeling of anticipation before sitting down to a meal in a place she knows. But tonight feels different. There's a heaviness in the air, something unspoken, a tension that lingers just below the surface. Evelyn knows the world has changed around her, changed in ways that are sometimes subtle and other times harsh, but she's determined to live through it, to keep going, to keep her place in this world. As she approaches the host stand, she feels it again, that subtle shift in the atmosphere. The young man standing there tall and stiff in his uniform looks at her as if he doesn't recognize her at all. But she's been here before, and he's seen her before. Evelyn sighs quietly, trying not to let the moment get under her skin. The last few years have been hard enough. Her husband's death, the loss of friends, the quiet shrinking of the world she once knew. She's come here tonight for a simple dinner, a bit of solace in an otherwise lonely routine. But as she steps closer, she has no idea that the encounter she's about to face will ignite a chain of events that will change everything, forcing her son, James Williams, to confront the ugliness lurking beneath the polished surface of his family's restaurant, and ultimately, the very forces of power and prejudice that have shaped their lives for so long. Evelyn approaches the host stand with a steady but deliberate pace, tapping her cane once more on the floor, the rhythm oddly soothing in the stillness. The restaurant's dimly lit interior feels like a sanctuary from the cold outside, its soft golden lighting reflecting off polished wood and gleaming glass. It's a place that once felt like home, a place where she could sit, eat, and feel like a person, not just an old woman who had seen too many years pass her by. But tonight, as she steps closer, something feels off. The young man behind the stand, his dark hair neatly combed and his uniform crisp, barely looks up as she approaches. He's scrolling through something on his phone, his posture stiff and disinterested. Evelyn clears her throat softly. "Excuse me," she says, her voice still smooth, though it carries a note of quiet strength. She has always been polite, even when the world hasn't been kind to her. "I believe I have a reservation, under the name Williams?" The young man glances up, his expression unreadable, almost dismissive. He doesn't respond immediately, as if he's sizing her up, weighing her presence with a quick, almost imperceptible judgment. There's a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to anyone who's lived long enough to recognize it. It's a look she's seen before, and it always leaves her stomach in a tight knot. He taps at the screen of his tablet and scrolls down. His fingers move quickly, but when his eyes land on the reservation list, his demeanor shifts, just slightly. "I'm sorry," he says, his tone flat. "I don't see anything under Williams." Evelyn's brows furrow in mild confusion. "I made the reservation 2 days ago. I'm quite sure it's there." He looks at her again, his gaze colder this time, almost like he's seeing her for the first time. His lips press into a thin line. "Sorry, ma'am, but there's no reservation for you here tonight. I'm afraid you might have made a mistake." Evelyn feels a sudden chill, not from the cold of the outside air, but from the sharpness of his words. She opens her mouth to respond, to explain herself, but something holds her back. It's not the first time she's been dismissed, but something about this feels different. This time, it feels personal. The confusion in her chest grows as the night air is cool and crisp as Evelyn Williams slowly makes her way down the sidewalk, her cane tapping softly against the cracked pavement with each step. She's not in a hurry. She never is anymore. But there's a rhythm to her movements, a deliberate pace that comes with age and wisdom. Her fur coat, once luxurious, is now a little threadbare at the edges, its rich brown color fading in the glow of the streetlights. Evelyn is 78 years old, and though time has bent her body, it hasn't broken her spirit. The street around her is quiet. The only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustling of leaves from the nearby trees. The world seems paused, holding its breath as she walks toward the restaurant, a place she's frequented for years. The upscale bistro looms ahead, its large glass windows reflecting the streetlights, the kind of restaurant that draws in those who want to be seen, refined, polished, and expensive. For a moment, it feels like another time to Evelyn, one when she would have been younger, perhaps out on the town with friends, or even better, out with her late husband, dressed up for a night of celebration. She stops outside the restaurant's heavy doors, adjusts her glasses and takes a breath, smoothing the fur around her shoulders. She's not nervous. She's used to this ritual, the familiar feeling of anticipation before sitting down to a meal in a place she knows. But tonight feels different. There's a heaviness in the air, something unspoken, a tension that lingers just below the surface. Evelyn knows the world has changed around her, changed in ways that are sometimes subtle and other times harsh, but she's determined to live through it, to keep going, to keep her place in this world. As she approaches the host stand, she feels it again, that subtle shift in the atmosphere. The young man standing there tall and stiff in his uniform looks at her as if he doesn't recognize her at all. But she's been here before, and he's seen her before. Evelyn sighs quietly, trying not to let the moment get under her skin. The last few years have been hard enough. Her husband's death, the loss of friends, the quiet shrinking of the world she once knew. She's come here tonight for a simple dinner, a bit of solace in an otherwise lonely routine. But as she steps closer, she has no idea that the encounter she's about to face will ignite a chain of events that will change everything, forcing her son, James Williams, to confront the ugliness lurking beneath the polished surface of his family's restaurant, and ultimately, the very forces of power and prejudice that have shaped their lives for so long. Evelyn approaches the host stand with a steady but deliberate pace, tapping her cane once more on the floor, the rhythm oddly soothing in the stillness. The restaurant's dimly lit interior feels like a sanctuary from the cold outside, its soft golden lighting reflecting off polished wood and gleaming glass. It's a place that once felt like home, a place where she could sit, eat, and feel like a person, not just an old woman who had seen too many years pass her by. But tonight, as she steps closer, something feels off. The young man behind the stand, his dark hair neatly combed and his uniform crisp, barely looks up as she approaches. He's scrolling through something on his phone, his posture stiff and disinterested. Evelyn clears her throat softly. "Excuse me," she says, her voice still smooth, though it carries a note of quiet strength. She has always been polite, even when the world hasn't been kind to her. "I believe I have a reservation under the name Williams?" The young man glances up, his expression unreadable, almost dismissive. He doesn't respond immediately, as if he's sizing her up, weighing her presence with a quick, almost imperceptible judgment. There's a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to anyone who's lived long enough to recognize it. It's a look she's seen before, and it always leaves her stomach in a tight knot. He taps at the screen of his tablet and scrolls down. His fingers move quickly, but when his eyes land on the reservation list, his demeanor shifts, just slightly. "I'm sorry," he says, his tone flat. "I don't see anything under Williams." Evelyn's brows furrow in mild confusion. "I made the reservation 2 days ago. I'm quite sure it's there." He looks at her again, his gaze colder this time, almost like he's seeing her for the first time. His lips press into a thin line. "Sorry, ma'am, but there's no reservation for you here tonight. I'm afraid you might have made a mistake." Evelyn feels a sudden chill, not from the cold of the outside air, but from the sharpness of his words. She opens her mouth to respond, to explain herself, but something holds her back. It's not the first time she's been dismissed, but something about this feels different. This time, it feels personal. The confusion in her chest grows as what's just transpired. James pulls out the chair for her, his actions deliberate, measured, too measured, as though he's trying to steady both of them in the face of something bigger than either of them anticipated. Sit, he says quietly, his voice calm but heavy with resolve. Evelyn takes a seat, her cane tapping the floor with an almost defiant rhythm. She feels the eyes of the other diners on her, the weight of their stares pressing into her skin. Some are too polite to look away. Others are too curious, too eager for drama. But all of them are aware of what just happened. The spectacle of a black woman being rejected at the door, only to be saved by her son. James, as always, is the one in control, but Evelyn can feel the tightness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tenses every time someone glances in their direction. "You're sure you want to stay?" he asks, his voice softer now, almost like he's asking for permission. Evelyn meets his eyes, her own filled with a quiet but fierce determination. "This is my place too, James. I'm not going anywhere." Her words hang in the air like a challenge, and for a brief moment, she can see something shift in her son's face. It's not just the anger over what happened, it's the weight of years of injustice, of the knowledge that even in a place he's built with his own hands, a place that should be safe, the world will always find a way to remind them of their place. The world will always remind them that they are black, that they are different. James nods, but there's something in the way he does it that makes Evelyn's heart sink. It's as though he's bracing himself for something, something that's about to come crashing down. She tries to ignore the feeling, tries to focus on the warmth of the restaurant, the scent of roasted meats and fresh bread wafting through the air. But the unease in her chest refuses to let go. "Would you like some water?" A server approaches, her voice a little too sweet, too eager, almost like she's trying to make up for the tension in the air. Evelyn nods gratefully. "Yes, thank you." As the server leaves, James takes a seat across from her, his hands resting on the table, fingers tapping absently. He doesn't meet her eyes immediately, his gaze focused somewhere distant, somewhere beyond the walls of the restaurant, where things are still far from resolved. The moment is fragile. The air is thick with the weight of all that's unsaid. Then the door swings open, and a pair of uniformed officers steps into the restaurant. Their presence is immediate, their heavy boots clicking on the floor like thunder, their eyes scanning the room as they take in the scene. It's a small town, and it's rare that the police are called to places like this, especially not for anything like this. The officers seem out of place, as though they were summoned not for a crime, but for something else entirely. The first officer, tall with a square jaw, looks around, his gaze landing on James almost instantly. The second, younger, with a crew cut, follows his partner's gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spots Evelyn at the table. For a moment, everything freezes. It's as though the room holds its breath, as the officers seem to assess the situation. An elderly black woman seated at a table in a high-end restaurant, her son, the owner, sitting across from her. The whole dynamic, the tension between them, feels almost too obvious. It's too easy. James doesn't flinch. His posture remains straight, calm, but there's a flicker of something in his eyes as he stands slowly, standing between his mother and the two officers who approach them. Evelyn watches him closely, her heart beating harder now, sensing the shift before he even says a word. "Can I help you, officers?" James asks, his voice still calm, but with an undercurrent of sharpness that makes the air vibrate with the weight of his authority. The older officer steps forward first, his eyes still scanning, his hands casually resting on the belt of his uniform. "We've received a complaint, sir," he says, his tone measured but stern, as if he's used to delivering these kinds of lines. "About a disturbance." James's brows furrow. "A disturbance? I don't know what you're talking about. My mother and I are just having dinner." The younger officer, a little more eager, looks at Evelyn now, his eyes scanning her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that doesn't quite add up. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" His voice is polite but clipped, almost too professional, like someone who's seen this scenario before. Evelyn's throat tightens, her pulse quickening. She knows what's happening now, and the weight of it settles on her chest like a stone. She looks at her son, who hasn't broken eye contact with the officers, but there's something darker in his expression now. He's no longer just trying to diffuse the situation. He's realizing, too, that this isn't about a complaint. This isn't about a complaint. This isn't about some imagined disturbance. This is about them, about the way they're perceived, the way they're treated, simply because of who they are. "No problem here," James replies, his voice cool but his muscles tense beneath his suit. "I own this place, officer, and as far as I can tell, no laws are being broken." The older officer glances at his partner, and for a moment, there's a silence, the kind that stretches out, filled with the weight of unspoken assumptions. The younger officer looks at the older one, then back at James, his expression hardening, though his stance is still too casual, too practiced. "You know," the younger officer says slowly, his eyes flicking to Evelyn, "it's not the best look having someone of her age and background in a place like this. Don't you think?" The words hang in the air like a slap. Evelyn feels a coldness spread through her chest, a surge of emotion she hasn't felt in a long time. Rage, humiliation, disbelief. But she doesn't say anything. She's learned over the years to hold her tongue, to bear the weight of injustice with a quiet dignity. But in this moment, it feels like her soul is being drained, piece by piece. James's face hardens at the officer's words, his fists clenching involuntarily. The younger officer, oblivious to the shift in the air, continues, oblivious to the deepening tension, his tone growing sharper. "I'm just saying, sir, that people like her, they don't usually come to places like this," the officer says, glancing at the other diners, whose eyes are now darting nervously between the officers and the Williams family. James takes a step forward, his voice low, dangerous. "People like her? What does that even mean? What do you think you're insinuating here?" Evelyn feels the weight of it all settle deeper, the suffocating realization that even here, in the very restaurant her son built, they are not safe from the oppressive gaze of the world. The world has a way of finding them, of pulling them back into their place. And no matter how many walls James builds, no matter how much success they achieve, they will never truly escape the darkness that haunts them. The older officer steps between the younger one and James, his voice now firm, trying to diffuse the rising tension. "Sir, we're just following up on a call. We'll be on our way in a minute." But it's too late. The damage has been done. James stands tall, unwavering, but the quiet rage in his eyes is unmistakable. "No," he says flatly. "You won't be going anywhere until you've cleared this up. And you're not leaving until you apologize. To my mother." The officer hesitates, and for the first time, there's doubt in his eyes. The tension crackles like a live wire, and Evelyn knows they're on the edge of something. Something that could either shatter them or change everything. The tall officer stands there for a long moment, his jaw clenched so tight it looks like it might crack. The air is thick with tension, suffocating in its weight. Every eye in the room is locked on him, on James, on the scene unfolding at the center of it all. Evelyn feels as though the very walls of the restaurant are closing in on them, the space suddenly too small, too tight for everything that is about to happen. She holds her breath, waiting, praying that somehow, in some miraculous way, this doesn't escalate any further. But she knows deep in her bones that it already has, and there's no turning back. The officer's eyes flicker briefly toward the other patrons, scanning their faces, seeking some sign of support, some unspoken solidarity. But all he finds is quiet fear, the kind of fear that makes people avert their eyes, pretend they're not witnessing something they know is wrong. Evelyn sees it too, the way the diners shrink back into their chairs, their gazes dropping, as if hoping to disappear in the face of something they can't control, something that has nothing to do with them, but everything to do with who's standing in front of them. Then, as if to remind everyone of who holds the power, the officer straightens, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "This is your last chance," he says, his voice cold, the words laced with a thinly veiled threat. His hand twitches, and for just a fraction of a second, it's as if he's about to grab for his weapon, to make this moment definitive, to end it with brute force. His fingers hover near the gun at his hip, and for a breathless second, Evelyn can feel the pull of that final moment, the irreversible escalation that will come with it. James sees it too. He watches the officer's hand, calculating the next move, weighing his options. And in that split second, he makes his decision. He takes a step forward, his feet planted firm on the ground, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. He's not afraid, not of the badge, not of the gun, not of any of it. What they don't understand, what the officer can't comprehend, is that James has spent his whole life walking in this world, in this skin, with the weight of expectations that he will bow, that he will shrink, that he will acquiesce. And he has never done it, not once. And he won't start now. "I said," James repeats, his voice low but unwavering, "get out." The officer's eyes narrow, and in the tension of that moment, it feels like the entire world is held in suspension, hanging by the thinnest thread. The younger officer, still holding his radio, glances nervously at his partner, then at the other officers, his face taut with anxiety. He seems unsure, unsure whether to push forward or step back, unsure of his place in the power dynamic that suddenly shifted so dramatically. But the older officer, the one who's been quiet up until now, looks back at James with something else in his eyes, a flicker of realization. Maybe it's the same realization Evelyn had when she saw her son stand up for her, that this isn't just a dispute between one man and a couple of officers. It's a stand for dignity, for self-respect, for everything they've had to fight for in a world that has never offered them a fair chance. Without warning, the tall officer's hand jerks out, grabbing for James's arm. The movement is fast, forceful, as if he's finally decided that this is the point where he'll take control, where he'll bend James to his will. But as his fingers make contact with James's sleeve, everything explodes. In a blur of motion, James wrenches his arm away, his muscles flexing with the force of it, and the officer stumbles back, shocked, his face turning a shade of red that deepens as he sees the defiance in James's eyes. The crowd stirs, a low murmur rising among the patrons. But no one dares speak out. No one dares move to intervene. They're all watching now, frozen in their seats, as if this is no longer just a disagreement. It's a spectacle, a battle, a moment where everything will change. The officer's hand moves to his gun. The flash of silver from the holster gleams in the dim light, and for a brief, horrifying moment, Evelyn thinks he's going to draw it. That this is the moment they'll all regret. The moment the situation tilts so far beyond reason that it becomes something irreversible. But just as quickly, the officer's hand hesitates. His fingers twitch, then draw back, unsure. Maybe he knows on some level that the gun would escalate this too far, that there's no going back if he pulls it. But the damage is already done. The tension snaps when the first shout rings out. It's from one of the patrons, a middle-aged man who suddenly stands from his seat, his hands raised in a futile attempt to defuse what's happening. "Hey!" he calls out, his voice trembling. "This isn't right! You can't just—" His words falter, his body betraying him, his eyes shifting nervously from the officers to the door, to the others around him. His courage isn't enough to sustain him, and within seconds he sinks back into his chair, defeated, the words hanging uselessly in the air. But the damage has been done. The words are out now. And in their wake, there's a ripple, a wave of tension that breaks the silence like a gunshot. Another voice, this time from a woman, chimes in, quieter but still firm. "You can't treat people like this." And then another voice, a younger man, his tone rising. "This isn't right. Let them go." It's a small thing, a whisper against the overwhelming authority of the officers. But in the quiet defiance of these few voices, something shifts. It's not a victory, not yet, but it's a crack in the armor, the first sign that things are changing. That maybe, just maybe, the system that has long upheld this kind of brutality is beginning to feel the weight of its own unjust nature. James's eyes sweep across the room, catching every glance, every uneasy face. He sees them, the patrons who have turned away, the ones who are too scared to speak out, the ones who wish they could be more than passive observers. He sees the same look in their eyes that he's carried for his whole life, the helplessness, the desire to do the right thing but the terror of what might happen if they do. And in that moment, something inside him snaps. He's done with waiting, done with hoping that people will step up when it's their turn. He's done with letting this country and these systems dictate the terms of his existence. "You don't get to decide for us anymore," James says, his voice rising. His words aren't just for the officers now. They're for everyone who's ever looked away, for everyone who's ever allowed injustice to stand unchallenged. This is our world too, and we'll stand for it. We'll fight for it. The words hang in the air, heavy with meaning, and for the first time, the officers hesitate. Something flickers in the tall officer's eyes. The certainty he once held begins to waver. For the first time, he begins to realize that this isn't the easy win he thought it would be. And that realization, however small, changes everything. It's not the end of the battle, but it's the beginning of something else. Something that won't be so easily suppressed. The silence that follows James's words is deafening, stretching out like a taut wire, waiting for something, anything to snap it. The room feels suspended, as though the world itself has paused to take a breath, unsure of what comes next. For a moment, it's as if time stands still. James can feel his pulse in his ears, the adrenaline still rushing through him, his muscles tense, his breath shallow. But in the back of his mind, something else begins to settle. An awareness that this moment, this act of defiance, has already changed everything. The words have been said, the tension has shifted, and now nothing will be the same. Evelyn watches him, her heart in her throat, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. She knows that the world will never be the same for him after today. Not after standing up in front of those officers, in front of everyone in this restaurant, and claiming his space, his dignity, his humanity. She knows the cost of defiance. She's lived it, felt it in the way doors closed, in the way people turned their backs, in the way the world punished those who dared to stand against it. But she also knows the power of this moment, the defiance of her son in the face of so much overwhelming force. For the first time in a long while, she feels something she hasn't felt in years. Hope. But before she can say anything, before she can reach for him again, the air shifts. There's a sudden sound, sharp like the screech of tires against asphalt, and James's gaze flicks to the door. He sees the flashing lights first, a wash of red and blue cutting through the windows, reflecting off the polished tables, painting the walls in chaotic patterns. Sirens wail in the distance, growing louder, closer, until the entire restaurant is trembling with the unmistakable sound of backup arriving. There's a moment of absolute stillness, and then chaos erupts. The door flies open, and more officers flood in. At least half a dozen, maybe more. Their uniforms crisp and their expressions cold, ready for whatever comes next. The weight of their presence fills the room, and the temperature seems to drop several degrees. The first wave of officers, still on edge, still unsure, step back slightly, allowing the newcomers to take the lead. The tall officer, who had been so sure of himself only moments before, stands off to the side now, looking as if he regrets the situation has escalated this far, his face a mask of frustration and barely contained anger. One of the new officers, a stocky man with a square jaw and an air of practiced authority, takes charge immediately, his eyes scanning the room with quick, predatory precision. His gaze flickers over James, then Evelyn, then the other patrons who are all sitting still, eyes wide, waiting to see how this will unfold. He doesn't speak at first, just assesses the room as if sizing up a threat. It's as if he's trying to calculate the best way to handle this, to restore control. "You two," the officer barks at James and Evelyn, pointing a thick finger in their direction. "Step outside. Now." The command is sharp, definitive. There's no room for negotiation in his tone, no ounce of empathy in the way he delivers it. James feels his heart race again, but this time, There's no hesitation in his response. He doesn't look at the officer, doesn't even acknowledge the order, because he knows. He knows this is the same system that has been crushing people like him, like his mother, like so many others for generations. He doesn't need to prove anything now. He's already proved that he won't be intimidated, that he refuses to shrink back into silence. No, James says simply, his voice cold and unyielding. The officer's lips curl in a tight smile, a sneer that doesn't reach his eyes. He steps closer, crowding James. But James doesn't move. "You've got one chance to make this easy on yourself," the officer warns, his voice a low growl. "Step outside, or we'll make you." Evelyn's heart thuds painfully in her chest as she watches the officer tower over her son. She can see the way the situation is spiraling again, the way they're trying to force him into submission with sheer numbers, with force, with intimidation. She reaches out, her hand trembling as she places it on his arm. "James, please," she whispers, her voice barely audible over the rising tension. She knows he's been through so much, knows what standing his ground might cost him, but she also knows that he's already made his decision. The moment is too far gone for retreat. The officer doesn't wait for another response. He reaches out to grab James by the arm, but before he can make contact, James jerks away, a sudden, fluid movement that forces the officer to stumble back, caught off guard. The room falls into an even deeper silence as everyone watches, some gasping, some holding, their breath in shock. The officer's eyes narrow, and in that instant, the shift happens. It's as if he's finally realized that he can't break James, not without consequences. The air becomes charged with the imminent threat of violence. Evelyn feels it first, her body tensing as though bracing for impact, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. There's a suffocating weight in the pit of her stomach as she watches the situation spiral, knowing that the backup officers, now fully alert in crowding the space, are just waiting for the excuse to escalate this further. The moment they've been waiting for has arrived. The trigger, the reason, the excuse to bring this all to a head. And then, unexpectedly, it happens. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor breaks through the chaos, a sharp, piercing noise that seems to fracture the mounting tension in the air. A man, one of the diners, stands up from his table, a middle-aged white man in a suit, his face pale but set with a strange kind of determination. He steps forward, his hands raised in an attempt to calm the situation. "Enough," he says, his voice cutting through the noise. "This has gone far enough." The officer, caught off guard, glares at him. "Sit down now," he orders, his voice rising with authority. But the man doesn't sit down. He steps closer, still calm, still resolute. "No," the man says again, his voice unwavering. "This isn't right. What you're doing here. This isn't right." His eyes lock on James, then Evelyn, and something shifts. It's subtle, but enough to break the tension. Other patrons begin to stir, some looking up, some shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the growing scene. A few eyes meet, unspoken understanding passing between them. For a moment, the officers seem unsure. The backup, still looming at the door, hesitates, and in that small window of doubt, something flickers. A hesitation that runs through the officers like a ripple in water. They look at each other, waiting for someone to take charge. But the power dynamic has already shifted. James is no longer the only one standing up to the system. Now in this small corner of the world, a handful of strangers are too. It's then that the door opens again, a few more officers walking in, but the atmosphere has already changed. The restaurant is on edge, but it's not just fear that lingers in the air now. It's something else, something more uncertain, more unstable. The officers, realizing they no longer have the complete control they once did, exchange quick, nervous glances. They've underestimated the power of this moment. Evelyn looks at James, her heart still racing, but a strange relief washing over her. The tide is shifting, ever so slowly, but it's moving. And with that movement, a feeling, small but real, of possibility begins to unfurl. The moment the officers hesitate, it feels like a turning point, however small. James doesn't feel victorious. There is no rush of triumph or relief flooding through him, only a weary, gnawing sense that the fight has only just begun. He stands there, heart still hammering, his body still coiled in the tension of the moment. He's not done yet, not by a long shot. The backup officers, still unsure, seem to read the room. There's no easy out now, no chance to sweep it under the rug. A couple of them glance at each other, shifting nervously. They can't pretend they didn't see what just happened. They saw the quiet resistance, the defiance of a son standing up for his mother, for his dignity, for everything that's been systematically stripped from them both. There's a growing weight in the room now, not just from the officers, but from the bystanders, the witnesses. A collective understanding that this moment won't fade into the background like so many others before it. James watches them, their stiff uniforms, their practiced expressions, and he realizes something. He doesn't care if they leave tonight or if they press charges. He doesn't care about anything but the truth. He cares about the injustice he just witnessed, the abuse of power, and how easily it could have been swept away. Just like every other incident before it. This isn't just about his mother anymore, about the humiliation they endured tonight. This is about something deeper, more insidious. This is about a system that treats people like them as expendable, as invisible. And tonight, in this restaurant, in front of everyone, James had decided once and for all that he would no longer be complicit in that silence. His thoughts race, but his face is calm, hard with resolve. He knows what needs to be done now. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't end here," he says quietly, his words directed toward his mother, but loud enough for anyone to hear. "This isn't over. They have to be held accountable." Evelyn doesn't need to ask him what he means. She can see it in his eyes. The same thing she's seen in him since he was a child. The same unyielding force that drove him to succeed in the world despite all the barriers, all the biases stacked against him. She knows this fight is bigger than the two of them. It's bigger than tonight. She has seen it before. The slow grind of justice, the quiet battles fought in boardrooms and courtrooms, the years it takes to make any real change. She's lived through those battles herself, and the scars they leave are never truly gone. But something in her stirs at the fire in his eyes. A mother's pride mixed with something else. Fear, maybe. Or the knowledge that, for once, he's the one leading the charge. She'd always protected him, always shielded him from the worst of the world's violence and hatred. But this time, she knows she can't protect him. She nods slowly, her voice soft but firm. "I'll be with you every step of the way." As the officers start to file out, the mood in the restaurant shifts. The tension lingers, but there's also a sense of quiet relief. Some patrons begin to leave, heads down, quick steps, but others linger, as if unsure how to leave this moment behind. One by one, the murmurs begin, low at first, but rising. That was wrong. What they did, that was wrong. They can't keep getting away with this. Someone needs to do something. James hears it all, the whispers that travel from table to table, the quiet solidarity from people who are still too afraid to speak up openly, but who have witnessed the truth tonight. He feels a strange mixture of disbelief and vindication. These were the same people who, moments ago, were too afraid to even make eye contact. And now they're here, acknowledging it, finally willing to say the words out loud. It doesn't make him feel better. It doesn't erase the humiliation or the fear, but it's a step, a tiny small step towards something that feels like real change. Outside, as the last officer drives off, the silence hangs in the air, but the adrenaline has finally begun to fade. James and Evelyn stand together in the stillness, and for a moment, nothing else exists. There's no world beyond this parking lot, no more police cars, no more injustice. Just the two of them, breathing deeply, grounding themselves in the weight of what they've just experienced. It's Evelyn who speaks first. "You'll make them hear you, James. You'll make them listen." His response is simple, his voice steady. "I'll make sure of it." The next day, James walks into his office with the same purposeful stride he's always had. But today, something feels different. The weight of last night still sits on his shoulders, but it's no longer an anchor. It's a fire, burning with an urgency he hasn't felt in years. He knows what he has to do. He takes a seat at his desk, pulls out his laptop, and starts typing. He drafts a letter. The language is firm but measured, carefully written to avoid any mistakes, any missteps. The words cut through the bureaucracy of it all, cutting through the layers of self-preservation that often keep people silent. He sends it to his lawyer, his contacts, local activists. It's the beginning of a movement, a demand for accountability, for transparency, for change. His phone buzzes, a message from an unknown number. He hesitates before opening it. "I saw what happened last night. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a platform. I can help. Let's talk." James's heart stirs. There's something in the message that gives him hope, something that tells him maybe, just maybe, this time it's different. Over the next few weeks, James and his lawyer sit down to make a case, reaching out to the diner witnesses, collecting testimonies, preparing to go public. News outlets begin to pick up the story, and though the police department tries to downplay the incident, the pressure builds. Video clips surface. One of the diners had recorded part of the altercation on his phone, the footage shaky but clear enough to capture the moment of escalation. A local journalist writes a story, and soon the story spreads like wildfire, igniting debates on social media, drawing support from civil rights organizations, and sparking discussions on police reform. In the quiet spaces between the chaos, James reflects. He thinks about how, all his life, he's watched his mother shoulder the weight of injustices like this. Her back always straight, her voice always steady, no matter how many times the world tried to push her down. He thinks about the other Black men and women in the community who have suffered in silence for far too long, who have been dismissed, ignored, or vilified. He knows that his fight, their fight, is far from over. But for the first time, he feels like there is a chance to make a real difference. The momentum is shifting. The world is starting to listen. And even though he knows the road ahead will be long, he's ready. Because this time, he's not fighting alone. Weeks pass, and the pressure continues to mount. The story of what happened that night in the restaurant spread, a fire igniting across the city and beyond. News stations cover it. Protesters rally in front of City Hall, demanding accountability. Social media is flooded with posts, hashtags, and calls for reform, amplified by voices that had once remained silent. James watches it all unfold from his office, the weight of his decision still fresh on his mind. But with each passing day, his resolve grows stronger. He knows they're making progress, small steps, but undeniable progress. The officers involved are placed on administrative leave, an investigation is promised, and for the first time, he feels the heavy hand of the system trembling under the pressure of its own wrongdoing. But even as the world shifts around him, James remains grounded in the reality that this isn't the end. It's only the beginning. He's had enough of the headlines, the promises, the empty gestures. Change doesn't come from appeasing the public with a few public apologies or carefully crafted statements. It comes from dismantling the structures that have long upheld these injustices, from making those who have been complicit confront the reality of their actions, from pushing forward with relentless conviction until the systems are finally held accountable. And James knows that for all the noise in the media, the real work lies ahead. One evening, as he walks out of his office, he pauses outside the building and looks up at the sky. It's a deep shade of purple as the sun sets, the stars just beginning to twinkle on the horizon. He takes a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that has happened, everything that is still to come. His phone buzzes in his pocket, a reminder of the constant battle. Another email, another meeting, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. He doesn't know what the future holds. The fight is far from over, and he knows that the road ahead will be long, fraught with setbacks, struggles, and more resistance. But as he stands there, the weight of his mother's quiet strength echoing in his chest, he feels a flicker of something more than exhaustion. It's hope, not the naive kind, but the kind that is earned, forged in the fire of injustice, and tempered by the commitment to see it through. In the quiet of the evening, he whispers to himself, barely audible, "We'll keep pushing. We won't stop." It's a promise he's made, not just to his mother, but to every person who has ever been silenced, ignored, or erased, to every person who has ever felt the weight of systemic racism, bearing down on them, suffocating their chance at justice. To every black man, woman, and child who has lived their entire lives under the shadow of prejudice. And in that moment, with the cool breeze of the evening against his skin and the sound of the city's pulse humming in the distance, James knows one thing with unwavering certainty. The fight isn't over, not by a long shot, but as long as there is breath in his lungs, he will keep fighting. And with that, he steps forward, ready to continue the journey, knowing that the change they've started is just the beginning. The world may have a long way to go, but every movement starts with one person, one act of courage, and one unwavering commitment to make a difference. And James, in his heart, believes they will get there.